Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glendavid Books. 1 week into the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and questions are being asked about Vladimir Putin's decisions as well as his wider behavior. There are now also some voices that ask, could he be pushed from his office? Those are the key issues I should raise today with India's former Foreign Secretary and former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Srinivasan. Mr. Srinivasan, I want to focus this interview on Vladimir Putin's decisions and his wider behavior during the present Ukraine crisis. Now, there is a view that when Putin launched the invasion on the 24th of February, diplomacy was actually working for him. He had recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as independent entities and sent in what he called peacekeepers, and the world seemed to have accepted that. Macron and Scholz were courting the Kremlin. Biden had in principle agreed to a summit meeting. And there were credible voices in Europe that were saying attention needs to be paid to Russia's interests. So did an invasion at that point make sense?
I think it's quite puzzling. As you say, many of the European leaders, the main three, the German Chancellor, the French President, and the British Foreign Secretary, Foreign Minister, all visited Moscow. They had discussions with Mr. Putin. The Americans seemed to recognize that there were some security issues that Russia had raised that needed addressing. The Americans and the Russians were in talks on cyber. They were in talks on arms control in Europe. It's all very odd. When Mr. Putin recognized both Luhansk and Donetsk, the Donbass, as independent entities, that didn't raise much of a flutter in the West either. And I think the rest of the world was getting used to Crimea as a part of Russia because there were some obvious logical issues at play here. It's all very odd. So it seemed that Mr. Putin had all the cards stacked in his favor. Since 1990, I don't think there was a similar degree of respect and attention given to Russia's assertions. I think that all of a sudden, Mr. Putin seems to have decided that invasion was better than negotiation. I find it extremely perplexing.
You're suggesting, and I'm simply asking for clarity, that at the point at which he launched the invasion on the 24th of February, in fact, diplomacy was pretty close to delivering what he essentially wanted.
That certainly seems to be my impression and the impression of many others also. In fact, I imagine that the West had various skeletons in its own cupboard. The bombing of Kosovo by the Americans, bombing of Belgrade, that is, by the Americans, the abortion of Kosovo from Siberia, the fact that Britain, France, and the Netherlands, even today, have overseas territories which are legitimized on the basis of the wishes of the population. All this seemed to be relevant for Crimea, for the Donbass also, and seemed to give Mr. Putin a very strong hand to play. So it is really almost counterfactual that he invaded Ukraine, which didn't seem to stand up either to reason or to the facts on the ground.
In which case, what do you think made him launch that invasion? Was it a terrible misreading of the situation? Was it hubris? Or is there a hint here of something else?
These are questions one finds it very hard to answer. I obviously have to assume that he thought that the invasion wouldn't lead to any great consequences for his country. He obviously felt that this would be accepted by the West in particular, and it would be considered a de facto situation as Crimea was. I think that this resulted from overconfidence. In fact, possibly it resulted from the fact that the negotiations with Western countries were actually moving quite well. As it turned out, of course, he seems to have come to the conclusion that dialogue with the West, with the Americans, with the Europeans can now be suspended or given up altogether. And as I said, he seems to have decided that diplomacy was no longer necessary for him. I think that he probably thought that he was strong enough, both militarily and politically, to take further steps beyond Donbass, beyond Crimea, without any opposition.
But there's a hint here that if you launch an invasion at a point when diplomacy is almost about to deliver what you want, then that decision is an irrational one. It's not just inexplicable, but it feels a bit irrational.
Well, I must say, I think it does. But obviously, having moved so many thousands of or tens of thousands of troops to the borders of Russia with Ukraine, and to have moved considerable forces also to the Belarus border with Ukraine, he probably felt that that although there were alarms from the West about a possible invasion, he probably thought he'd just call their bluff. But it is inexplicable. To my mind, it's not logical.
So you would agree that this is irrational?
I would imagine so. Of course, we don't know what is the actual rationale in the walls of the Kremlin, but on the face of it, it does appear extremely perplexing and illogical.
The justification he's given the world is hardly convincing. He first claimed that there was genocide taking place in Ukraine, and there's absolutely no proof of that at all. And then he claimed that he was acting in self-defense, and there's no sense in which Ukraine can threaten the Russian Federation. So neither of those justifications make sense, do they?
Well, again, in many ways, the language of international diplomacy has got very corrupted over the years. It's not only Mr. Putin, but also many leaders in the West that have used extremely strong, unstatesmanlike, undiplomatic, if you like, language. But this kind of rhetoric coming from Mr. Putin is rather alarming, and really, as you said, I think unjustified by the circumstances on the ground.
In fact, there was that bizarre rambling speech he made where he threatened countries that may choose to defend or support the Ukraine with consequences the likes of which history has never seen. And then 2 days later, he took a further step and put his nuclear forces on alert. What does that tell you about his state of mind?
Well, delving into his state of mind is something that is completely beyond my competence. But I will say that these are all actions which cause considerable alarm, and not only, I think, in the West, but in other parts of the world as well. I think the UN Secretary General himself has commented that this is not the kind of language he would have expected from an international statesman. I think that this kind of rhetoric can be taken in two ways. One way is that it could be taken as a threat, that there are far more military assets that the Russians have that they can deploy in any given situation. And on the other hand, it can be taken as a sign of weakness, that in fact, Mr. Putin has not got yet what he seeks to deliver to the Russian people.
Let's then at this point ask that question. If it's weakness, Does it suggest there's a measure of desperation coming into play as well? That he's launched an invasion, it's not working as he wanted, he's looking as if he's going to end up with egg all over his face, which is why this irrational language now becomes something he indulges in.
Well, it's very early days, but I think we can't draw those conclusions yet. I think, though, that there was a close associate of his in the Kremlin that said recently that Mr. Putin expected victory in Ukraine to be accomplished within about 3 days. Now, I think we're in the 7th day, and clearly things are not going as well for Mr. Putin as he perhaps expected. On the other hand, it's very difficult really to see any finality yet. It's very hard to draw any complete conclusions from this war, because we get, as is usual in such cases, very mixed signals. There are some commentators who feel that the Russians have, in fact, from time to time, slowed their operations in order to allow, let us say, in order to diminish the prospect of Russians actually killing Ukrainians, because they're considered to be kith and kin. There are other views that say that the advance has in fact been stopped or repelled in certain places by the Ukrainians. There are also puzzles about air power. It seems that the Ukrainians are doing extremely well, relatively speaking, against Russian air power, but Russian air power does not seem to have been used very liberally in Ukraine yet. So there are certain puzzles in this whole situation as far as the military operations are concerned. What we could say, I think almost certainly, is that matters have not gone according to plan as far as Mr. Putin is concerned. And I think that there are more countries which have come into this picture than he had expected. Of course, there are signs perhaps that Belarus has entered the conflict as well. And as far as Ukraine is concerned, there is talk of various foreign legion volunteers coming to Ukraine, and apart from the mobilization of their own people. So I think that in this confusion, I think we find it hard to draw definite conclusions, but let us just say things have not gone according to Mr. Putin's plan in terms of timetable.
You may not be able to draw definite conclusions, but surely from Putin's point of view, worrying questions are now being asked. The expectation was that Russia had the might and the strength to cut through the Ukraine like a hot knife slices through butter. That hasn't happened. Repeatedly, the Americans have said that the Russian advance is stalled. The BBC is reporting that, in fact, the Ukrainian Air Force is still flying, it's not grounded. Clearly, the Russians have not got control of any major city. Even their control of Kharkiv is now being denied and disputed. Therefore, in these circumstances, don't two questions arise which worry Mr. Putin. First, has he been misled by his generals? Secondly, is their military judgment mistaken? And thirdly, are there now question marks about Russia's military prowess?
Yes, I think that all military headquarters and military staff throughout the world are going to be watching this conflict very closely. Indeed, as they watch all conflicts throughout the world, and I think they might come to the same conclusion that you do, that firstly, the operations have not gone according to Mr. Putin's timetable because of unexpected resistance by Ukraine. Secondly, I think they might come to the conclusion that the Russian strategy and Russian logistics, particularly, because we hear that some of the vehicles are lacking petrol, which is very surprising indeed. And they might also come to the conclusion that Russian equipment is perhaps overestimated in the rest of the world. So I think that it would be correct, I think, to think that that observers might indeed draw those conclusions that that the Russian military machine is lacking many essentials.
That is a devastating blow for a country that considers itself a military superpower.
Yes, I think so, yes. So I think we could perhaps put some of Mr. Putin's excessive rhetoric into that context. His disappointment that his military machine hasn't performed better.
What about something else? It's now beyond doubt that the Russian invasion has brought Russia nothing but disrepute. The world has united against Russia. There are even sizable protests in his own country. So on top of the military setback and the questions that are being asked understandably about Russia's military prowess, Putin now also has a huge cloud hanging over Russia's political standing.
Yes, I think that's also true. I think from a very high point in the middle of February or thereabouts, I think that matters have taken a very unexpected turn. And I would say they have not gone well for Mr. Putin. I think he has lost a good deal of credibility by his actions and by his comments. I think that in the UN General Assembly, you'll probably find that very many countries in the developing world have reservations who may abstain in the final resolution. But this will be, I think, more due to misgivings about the West's colonial past, about the West's illegal interventions in various parts of the world, than actually in support of Russia. I think the same might apply to some other countries as well, not in the developing world, but perhaps in the case of for example, China, perhaps even India. But I think the fact remains that Russia has lost a great deal of political capital throughout the world by these operations in Ukraine, and I think it's going to be very hard to make up that deficit in credibility.
Let me raise one other thing that's happened, which is also perplexing, if not inexplicable. In the middle of an invasion that's by no means over, and clearly at the moment doesn't look as if it's heading towards blazing success, Putin has started to offer talks. In fact, the second round of talks are going to be happening today, Wednesday. Does that suggest that, in fact, he's looking for a way out?
Well, it could be smoke and mirrors, of course, a distraction. On the other hand, many of Russia's known friends, including India, including China, Iran, have urged that there should be an end of the hostilities and a return to negotiations of some kind. And yet these talks, as you say, the second round of which are going to take place today, don't look terribly promising because the Russian delegation is led at a rather low level. And both sides, in any case, have begun by making claims that the other side is very unlikely to accept. But we can only hope against hope that the talks might lead to a ceasefire. That perhaps is the best we can expect.
Except that a man who believes that he has the power of the Russian military machine behind him and can cut a swathe through Ukraine doesn't, in the middle of an endeavor where he's not succeeding, start offering talks unless A, he wants to appear contradictory, or B, this is a way of accepting I'm not making the military success I would have wanted, and therefore I need a way out.
No, I think it's probably a higher priority for him to respond to the urgings of the friends of Russia in the international community who have wanted to see some degree of negotiation taking place despite all the obstacles.
Okay, let's then look briefly at the terms Putin has set for ceasefire. He wants denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. But Ukraine doesn't have a Nazi government. Both the president and the prime minister are Jews. And it's very unlikely that any country bordering Russia will willingly demilitarize. So clearly, those are strange terms to set, aren't they?
Yes, I think those are very difficult. They're difficult terms also to analyze and to define. Possibly by demilitarization, Mr. Putin means moving to neutrality. Possibly he's thinking of some kind of situation like that which obtains in Sweden or Finland. Of course, neither the Swedes nor the Finns have demilitarized, though their political status, their international status is one of neutrality. So it's very difficult to break down that word into what he really thinks it should mean. As far as denazification is concerned, well, we all know that neo-Nazis do exist in Europe. We know that several countries have units which could be described as neo-Nazis. And we also know that they exist in Ukraine as well. I think there in Ukraine, they're called the Azov Brigade, and they're very belligerent, anti-Russian, of course. But I think to say that the Ukraine government or the Ukraine army is composed of former Nazis or present Nazis, I think is a gross exaggeration.
There are two other conditions that have been set, one by, I believe, Putin himself, another by Sergei Lavrov, his foreign minister, yesterday. Putin wants international recognition that Crimea is Russian territory. It's very possible that Ukraine could accept that because it's a fait accompli as far as they're concerned. But whether the rest of the world will or not is an open question. But Lavrov's demand is clearly not going to be acceptable to Europe. He wants all American nuclear weapons to be withdrawn from Europe, which I can't see happening. And secondly, he's spoken cryptically, if not ominously, about the Ukraine retaining what he calls Soviet-era technological capacity, suggesting that even though Ukraine has signed the non-proliferation treaty and voluntarily given up its nuclear weapons, somewhere it's hiding a capacity to make more and maybe even hiding actual bombs.
Well, as far as Mr. Putin's introducing Crimea into the discussion is concerned, it's very odd again, and not really logical, because in fact, Crimea's status has been more or less accepted, maybe reluctantly, maybe not openly, by most of the world. And I think that there are several reasons why Crimea's unification with Russia made good sense. And I think that the world has come to the same conclusion. It's very strange indeed that Mr. Putin has now, let us say, reopened this Pandora's box. There was some years ago a United Nations General Assembly resolution on Crimea, when there were a huge number of abstentions. The yes votes did carry the day that the annexation of Crimea was illegal, but the number of abstentions there should have given some considerable satisfaction to Mr. Putin. Reintroducing this topic is extraordinary concession, if you like, by Mr. Putin. As you say, even if recognized by Ukraine under duress, which I think is unlikely, it won't be recognized by many of the other parts of the Western world. In regard to Mr. Lavrov's comments, Mr. Lavrov himself has become, I think, of late rather unpredictable. Ukraine has, as you know, voluntarily withdrawn its claimed to be a nuclear weapons country. I don't see any reason whatsoever that anyone would challenge that status.
We're coming to the end of this interview, but before I close, let's focus once again on what the outcome could mean or imply for Mr. Putin. Going by the way this military misadventure by Russia seems to be ending up, do you believe it can actually close as a success? Or by launching an invasion, has Putin pulled a military setback and embarrassment out of the jaws of what looked increasingly like diplomatic success?
Yes, I think that's well put. I think he has managed a military and political defeat. Perhaps that's too strong a word, but a serious setback from what looked like an imminent diplomatic victory. However, I think that the consequences are going to be much wider. And I think that isolation that Russia has incurred by this invasion, I think that both the Russian elite and the Russian people are going to suffer enormously. I think the sanctions which have been imposed are going to mean isolation from the rest of the world. Airlines can't fly, visas will be very difficult to get. There are going to be problems with travel, tourism, acquisition of technology, the economy. I think it's very difficult. Culture, sports. It's going to be across the board an extremely hard pill to swallow. And as you know, there have been demonstrations in more than 50 countries, in the 50 cities in Russia against the war. There have been certain powerful businessmen from Russia who've spoken against the war. Mr. Putin seems to have united Europe, a very fragmentary Europe before, in the sense that both Poland and Hungary, both outliers in the European Union, have agreed to take refugees without capping their numbers. He's managed to unite the NATO countries under the leadership of the USA, which looked again extremely uncertain in the years under Mr. Trump. So I think that in many respects, you've got the UN Secretary General from the podium of the United Nations criticizing a permanent member of the Security Council, which is extremely unusual, to say the least. So given all these setbacks, I think it's really hard to see how any political leader could survive. But then that takes us to the realms of speculation. And of course, not only realms of speculation about Mr. Putin's future, but considerable uncertainty about what might follow.
Well, let me ask you that question bluntly. In these circumstances, do you personally think his position could be in doubt?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think that it would be an extraordinary feat of resilience for Mr. Putin to bounce back from this. In the circumstances which now exist, we can't, of course, foretell the future, but in the present situation, the situation for Russia and for its leadership look very bleak.
So would it be a palace coup or a putsch that would gently ease him out? Or do you see something else?
I couldn't possibly speculate on that. But I think the fact that so many people in Russia, ordinary people who are going to feel the pinch, have come out to demonstrate despite the nasty prospect of being beaten up or being imprisoned, I think shows you that the discontent in Russia about this move against what they consider to be kith and kin in Ukraine, the discontent level is very high.
So the Putin era looks as if it could be coming to a close. And for Mr. Putin, a sad end.
Well, I'm sure that many of his political opponents, both inside and outside the country, would like to see that that conclusion. We can't, of course, speculate on what might happen in the immediate future, but it wouldn't surprise me if many people in Russia felt that this is a situation which gives them no credit, and it's a situation which has been engineered from the top. But as I said, if that turns out to be the case, what follows thereafter is also a prospect which is very uncertain.
Absolutely. We can't talk about what happens after Mr. Putin goes, but the important point is you do believe his position can now be in doubt. And as you put it, it would be an extraordinary feat of resilience for Putin to bounce back from this situation. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Srinivasan. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.